back. My name is Dr. Vera Tarman, and I am an addictions physician working out of Toronto, Canada. And I am here today to talk about, does cocaine make you smarter? So first of all, what is cocaine and what is smarter? So cocaine is derived from the coca leaf, and it is essentially operates as a stimulant. Well, it actually does two things. It acts as a stimulant, and it also acts as a euphoric high, which is both the adrenaline response. Essentially, cocaine is adrenaline on steroids, and dopamine is the neurochemical that is responsible for giving us that feeling of euphoria. So it would make sense that cocaine would both make you feel more pleasant, which it does, and make you think that you are faster or smarter. And in fact, a faster is a definition of intelligence. So let's talk about what is intelligence. Intelligence is essentially a multifactorial construct that it's measurable in many different ways. Essentially, intelligence can be categorized as two things. We have what's called fluid intelligence and crystallized intelligence. And crystallized intelligence is that intelligence that's broad and expansive. The more you read, the older you get, the more knowledge you have, and the more knowledge you have to access. And essentially, you have more neurons that have been fused together to give you more information that's somewhere in the back of your head to draw upon. And then there's fluid intelligence, which is how quick you are. And often younger people who don't have the years of experience to draw upon show up as seemingly more intelligent because they're faster. And if you want to see it as cocaine does make you faster because of that adrenaline response, but it doesn't necessarily access that crystallized intelligence, which relies on perspective and breadth of wisdom and experience, often related to memory. So does cocaine make you smarter? Well, the short answer is yes, initially it may appear to, but overall, no. And in fact, it actually makes you dumber in the long term. So just a couple of things about the short-term effects of cocaine. It sort of has physical effects because there's that adrenaline piece. It has psychological effects. That's also because of the adrenaline effect and also the dopamine effect. And then as a consequence, because of the physical and mental, there's behavioral effects. But let's look at the actual physical effects. When a person actually imbibes in cocaine or crack, the initial experience, increased alertness, euphoria, and energy. And that's probably where a person thinks that they're smarter. When you use cocaine, generally people use it by smoking it or snorting it or injecting it. So it's a fairly immediate response. There is no cocaine pill. I mean, there are smart pills. We'll talk about that shortly, but there's no pill. So all of this happens fairly quickly. So within the next half an hour or so, the physical response starts to sort of maximize, peak. You don't want to eat, you have decreased appetite, your heart rate goes up and your blood pressure goes up. And then over the next hour or two, as the high has, there's a sort of peak experience of within maybe 1 to basically 4 hours, but the peak is within an hour to two. If you smoke crack, it's less than that. After about 2 hours or so, it's like you're on adrenaline. You start to get irritable and restless and potentially paranoid. And when I talk about drug-induced psychosis in another video, I can explain how cocaine leads to paranoia. So you have that experience after 1 to 2 hours. Because you're basically on a high, it's like you're racing, running on a treadmill, and the drug starts to wane. You start to feel the depression and fatigue. And then over the next 4 to 24 hours. I mean, it's just like if you have a coffee, you drink too much coffee, the effect of the coffee is gone, but you're still wired in a way. And cocaine is a stimulant, like coffee is a stimulant, all of these things. Even though the beneficial effect is gone, there's that residual effect, which is anxiety and actually difficulty concentrating. So that can last for quite a long time. So that's the immediate impact of cocaine. And then there's the long-term consequences that if you're taking a drug that basically puts your adrenaline system on overdrive, are going to end up having consequences. And that would be things like addiction, which we'll talk about in another video, cognitive impairment, which I want to talk about in this one, and organ damage. In other words, heart attack potentially and stroke potentially. So now let's talk about some of the actual brain effects of cocaine. I've mentioned it is a stimulant and it also affects dopamine. It enhances dopamine. And how it does that is it actually impairs the disruption of communication between neurons in such a way that you might say that's the beneficial effect. You've heard of the serotonin reuptake inhibitors like Prozac and all of the antidepressants. Well, cocaine is kind of a similar function, except that it's with the dopamine receptor, not the serotonin receptor. And the immediate effect of why is cocaine working? Because it's actually letting the brain brain have access to more dopamine than they would normally have. And dopamine is that neurochemical of excitement and thrill and speediness and the sense of I am better than I ever have been. I'm smarter than anybody else. I'm smarter than I am usually. It gives you that sense of grandiosity, as it were. And so there's where that feeling of cocaine makes me smarter might actually come from. And it does make you faster. So that's that piece. And then cocaine also impairs decision making because it affects the frontal lobe, and I'm going to show you that in a second. And decision making in the frontal lobe, well, we need that. That's the thing that makes me use a bit of that intelligence, the other intelligence that I was talking about, the crystallized. If I've done something in the past rashly and abruptly, I've learned, oh my God, I better start thinking about my behavior, because I can't just do these things off the cuff, like yell at somebody or make a turn on the road that's wrong. Just I learn over time as I mature that, I'm from my past experience, this is not a good idea. So you're faster, but you can't connect essential dots. The other thing that cocaine does is it actually affects memories. And of course, if you don't have the access to that information that you've learned, your previous wisdom, there's no pockets of knowledge that you have normally when you're sober that are available to you at that time. Now here's a graph from NIDA, the National Institute of Drug Abuse. This is just to give you an idea that where cocaine affects brain regions. So the prefrontal cortex, that's my ability to think and logically reason out. As I said, I better not do this because it doesn't make sense to do this, is affected. That's the main thing that's affected. Then the next thing that's affected is the hippocampus. That's where our short-term memory is. And so again, we don't have our ability to use the pockets of information that we have to connect those dots. So you have speed, but you don't have good rationality, good reason. You can't use your reason, it's impaired, and you can't use your memory, that's impaired. And then finally, the amygdala, which is the emotional center of our brain, or it's actually where the fear response comes from, and that too is affected. And the amygdala, it's not as affected as much, but the amygdala is pretty important because that's the thing that kind of gives us that sense of warning that, oh, this is dangerous, I better avoid this. You lose that sense, hence you become more reckless. So when you use cocaine, you think that you're smarter, you're faster, but your rationality is diminished, your memory is diminished, and your sense of caution is diminished. Now, I mentioned that cocaine is a stimulant, and it's ingested usually by smoking or snorting or IV drug use. It's usually not ingested by a pill, but we do have pills that have a similar effect to cocaine, and those are typically what we call the smart drugs. And these are the drugs that essentially build on the adrenaline system. They make us fast, but they don't have the immediate effect of the euphoria unless you take a lot of them or you inject them, which is what many people do, but they have the effect of making you faster. And so as a result, they sort of tap into the strength of the adrenaline system. Now, smart drugs are drugs that are typically used for attention deficit disorder or for people when they want to just be smarter because they have an exam the next day and they want to be able to cram in a lot of information and bam, 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 just get all of that info down quickly. You're just a lot faster. You're able to focus more. And part of that is because when you're using your adrenaline system, you're speedy, and when you're highly adrenalized, in other words, when you're very anxious, when you're very frightened, essentially everything sort of focuses down into the moment. So things seem to paradoxically slow down, and your ability to focus and hear and sense things is much more acute. And this is the reason why they work for attention deficit disorder, because they actually paradoxically seem to slow things down. I mean, this happens to everybody, not just people with attention deficit, but those who have attention deficit feel the beneficial effects of that more than another person who might not notice it because that's not an issue for them, but they'll feel the other effects, which are the insomnia and the agitated feeling. But cocaine does that too, because they're both stimulant based, but cocaine a lot more. So hence you could say it's the ultimate smart drug, but it has, like I said, the consequences that it does. And so do smart drugs potentially have these other effects. So getting back to cocaine, I will do another video on smart drugs because I think that they too can be used as a drug of abuse on the street and often are. Okay, so getting back to cocaine. So overall, there's a cognitive impairment, which then consequently leads to a decrease in IQ, which is an interesting thing. And just to show you on this next slide, also from National Institute of Drug Abuse, if we have 10 for normal intelligence, cocaine can cut it in half. So the fact that you feel that you're smarter is just the euphoric effect of the dopamine. IQ has declined, and then because of that, decreased performance. Because if you're basically not firing on all cylinders in the executive functioning, the frontal lobe, the part of us that thinks and then uses memory to think in more detailed manner, you're going to have an overall decrease in performance, which is shown on research. What does that translate to? That would translate to impaired motor skills. Now, maybe not initially in that initial high, but remember that initial high is only in that first hour to 2, maybe 3 hours, but not beyond that. Certainly not in the residual effects of 24 hours later. And a person who's using on a regular basis is not high all the time. Most of their time actually is in withdrawal and wanting the high and then getting the high, which is short-lived and ever short-lived the more that they're using, until actually at a certain point there's almost no high left. It's just trying to not feel the residual long-term effects. In other words, trying to feel normal. So then, therefore, these impaired motor skills will continue for a longer period of time than that sharpness maybe at the very beginning. And your reaction time as well will be affected. And this can continue, as I said, long after cocaine is stopped. So if I haven't convinced you that cocaine doesn't make you smarter, you might say, well, it makes me feel smarter when I need it, which might be at the very beginning. Just to say, here's the costs, besides just that little bit of maybe extra feeling of smartness, I'll put it that way. There's a lot of consequences to cocaine, which again are the effects of the overuse of the adrenaline system, far more than the body can handle, and also of the dopamine system. Well, you're going to have loss of appetite, which is associated with the stimulant effect. You're going to lose weight, which, by the way, is why a lot of people will use cocaine or crack. They do. It's called the Jenny Crack diet. They use it for that effect. And also the smart drugs, which, like I said, were used for attention deficit disorder, but they also have a approved use for people with binge eating disorder who are gaining weight. And so their appetite is suppressed and then they lose or maintain their weight. Again, back to the stimulant effect, you get insomnia, you can't sleep, and it happens with smart drugs as well. And then because it is focusing on the dopamine system as well, it will also affect your anxiety and depression, which is what those boxes are there, will affect your mood. So that's a big cost to pay for just a little bit of short-term feeling of being smart. Just in summary, the cost of this feeling smarter and maybe being a touch smarter at the very beginning of the high, it's a very highly addictive drug. It becomes that way over time. Within week 1 to week 5 of regular use, tolerance develops, which means that you need more and more to get the same effect. You get more and more to get the same effect, and each time you get the effect, that effect is getting less and less and less. That's pretty expensive cost, both financially and your lifestyle. That's all I want to say about does cocaine make you smarter? Basically, no, it does not make you smarter, but it will give you the illusion that you are smarter. If you want to learn more about the effects of cocaine, listen to another video. Thank you.